There are countless story structure blueprints out there, and most of them have something valuable to offer. But I'll admit it, I've always been a little cautious about recommending any of them to my clients. Why? Because when writers cling too tightly to structure, their novels can end up feeling mechanical, like a paint by numbers project instead of like a vibrant and dynamic story. That said, there is one story structure method that I recommend and I use with all the incredible writers I coach. Save the cat. Why do I love it so much? It's simple. It's an aerial plot structure. Save the cat doesn't box you into plotting every tiny detail. Instead, it offers just enough structure to keep your story on track while leaving you the creative freedom to let your inspiration soar. That's why in today's episode, I'm going to start walking you through the Save the Cat story framework, the exact way I teach my clients to use it so you can apply it to your own manuscript, whether you're drafting or revising. Hello and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Writing Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world too. If you've been listening to this podcast or receiving my emails for very long, then you know I wrote my first novel when I was 15. I will never forget the thrill of typing "the end" on that first draft. After all, I'd spent an entire year writing the novel, which felt like an incredibly long time to be doing anything. And when I finished it, it was just like this huge victory. But then something completely unexpected happened. When I went back and reread it, I realized that something didn't quite measure up to the novels I loved. Think everything Stephen King and Anne Rice. The novel wasn't bad exactly, but I could tell that something was missing. I could tell that it wasn't quite the right shape. That's the only way I could think to describe it at the time. But the problem was, I had no idea what the right shape was or how to go about figuring that out. So I did what a lot of naive writers do. I shelved that manuscript and I started a new one. I convinced myself that this time I would magically include all the right elements to make the story work. And guess what? The same thing happened again. And again. And by the time I had written manuscript number 3, and it still wasn't working, I realized I was just stuck in a pattern that I didn't know how to break. And here's the thing. I see the exact same pattern happening to the writers who come to me for help. They usually wind up at my digital doorstep after many years of struggling to write a novel they're proud of. Sometimes they struggle for 5 or 10 or even 20 years before they decide to reach out to someone to get help. And after talking to these hardworking writers for only a short amount of time, I can see that the problem is, in many cases, that they are exactly like I was at 15. They still don't know the shape of a good story. That's where Save the Cat comes in. This story structure blueprint is a game changer. I love it because it's universal, it's straightforward, and it gives you just the right amount of guidance to keep your story on track without getting in your way and making your story feel mechanical or paint by numbers in any way. That's why I use it with literally all of my coaching clients and why I use it in my own writing as well. Okay, I could go on and on about why I love Save the Cat, and no, I am not a Save the Cat affiliate in any way. I just really love this story structure. So let's go ahead and dive into it. I'm going to be explaining the Save the Cat story structure using the Pixar movie Up. But before we dive in, I do want to take just a moment to explain why I've chosen to break down the Save the Cat beats using a movie instead of a book. First, more people have seen a movie than have read any single book. And it's easier to identify the story elements in something that's familiar. Second, movies are often more condensed and visually clear, making the beats just a lot easier to spot when you're new at looking for them. So if you haven't seen the movie Up yet, I highly recommend watching it. I really, really love this movie. It makes me cry. It makes me smile. It makes me have all the feels. I think it's a masterpiece of storytelling. But don't worry if you haven't seen it and you don't want to go watch it. I will walk you through everything you need to know right here on the podcast. But there is one more thing I want to say before we dive into the teaching part of this podcast. I think that if you are going to understand the Save the Cat story structure and then go apply it to your own writing, you need to actually study it and you need to see how it works in novels. So, in order to do this, I think it's really easy to go look at the summaries of novels and you can start spotting the elements I'm going to talk about today. If you don't have time to read like 100 books in the next month, that's okay. Summaries are a great way to study the structure without actually having to read the entire novel. Not to say that you shouldn't read the entire novel, but I know that I've studied the structure of many novels that I haven't had time to read. So it's kind of a way of shorthanding the ones that I know I just don't want to dedicate maybe 10 or 20 hours to. And the resource that I really love using is Super Summary. Yes, there is a price for Super Summary. I don't think it's a very high price. I honestly can't remember. But this resource is amazing, and you can look up almost any book there is, and you can skim through the key points of the novel. You can go for the overall summary or even chapter by chapter. It's just this really fast, effective way to see how the beats work in novels too. And you'll begin to see that you can spot them everywhere. They are just sort of universal to story structure. And I truly believe that the more examples you see, the more intuitive they'll become to use in your own story. Okay, let's start at the beginning of the Save the Cat story structure. This framework is broken down into 15 big beats that form the foundation of your novel, guiding you from the first page to the last. In this episode, we'll focus on Act 1, covering the first few beats. We'll save Acts 2 and 3 for upcoming episodes, giving you a little bit of time to really let this sink in and practice it by applying it to your own story. The opening image is the first beat of the Save the Cat framework, and it also represents the first scene of your novel. It's where the story begins. This scene sets the tone, introduces key themes, invites the audience into your story world, and introduces them to a protagonist that they want to root for. But the goal is not just to introduce the reader to your protagonist and their world. It's also to subtly convey what's missing in the protagonist's life so that when they reach the story's end, they can see just how far the protagonist has come. In order to fully understand this beat, though, let's take a tiny step back and review the purpose of a novel. It's important to remember that a novel isn't just about a bunch of fun or exciting stuff happening to your protagonist. Nope, it's about bringing about change in your protagonist. Your novel is a transformation machine, there to transform your protagonist from a deeply flawed person who holds some sort of a misbelief into a less flawed person who has adopted a healed belief. Which means the opening image should be a visual representation of the flawed person that your protagonist starts out as. It should hint at their misbelief. Think of this as the before snapshot of your story, showing readers what life looks like for your protagonist before the adventure starts and before the change begins to happen. Basically, the opening image helps establish the status quo world. It should give readers that vague feeling that your protagonist is stuck and desperately needs change in order to survive, either literally or figuratively. Even though I'm going to use the movie Up as my main example for all the Save the Cat story beats, I would be remiss at this moment if I didn't mention Ebenezer Scrooge. After all, I think A Christmas Carol has maybe the most iconic opening image ever. When the novel opens, we see Scrooge sitting at his desk, counting money, keeping a sharp eye on his clerk, Bob Cratchit. A moment later, Scrooge's nephew arrives and invites his uncle to Christmas dinner, which Scrooge promptly dismisses with a bah humbug. If that's not a perfect opening image, then I don't know what one is. What I love about this scene is that it really is a visual display of Scrooge's before life and all the flaws that need changing. We immediately understand that he is mean and selfish and stingy. But throughout the opening of the novel, we will also learn that he has a misbelief. His misbelief is that wealth is the only way to secure happiness and avoid the suffering that he endured as a child. Okay, enough about Scrooge. Let's take a look at my example from the movie Up. In the opening image of Up, we meet 8-year-old Carl Fredricksen, a shy and awkward little boy dressed up as a mini explorer. He's watching a newsreel about his hero, Carl Muntz, the world's greatest adventurer, who has been on a year-long expedition to Paradise Falls, which they think of as a lost world in South America that has never before seen plants and animals. As the newsreel shows Muntz exiting his plane, he says to the camera, "Adventure is out there." And we can see little Carl's eyes light up, and we know that Carl 100% believes that adventure is out there in the world in places like Paradise Falls. Even when scientists accuse Muntz of fabricating a skeleton of a monster of Paradise Falls, Carl remains steadfast in his admiration for Muntz. This moment not only introduces Carl's utter fascination with adventure, but also hints at his vulnerability and his need for connection. It also sets up Carl's misbelief that adventure is something that happens only in faraway, exotic places like those his hero visits. The second beat in your novel is called the theme stated beat, though I tend to call it the point stated beat. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that the point is the heart of your story, the core message or moral takeaway your novel is trying to communicate. It's not just a casual theme like racism or friendship. Instead, it's the big idea, the deeper truth your story is working to prove about the world. For example, if you are writing a novel where racism is the major theme, then maybe your point, your argument, is that racism flourishes when we dehumanize one another. If you're still a little shaky on what I mean by the point of your novel, I encourage you to go check out episode number 1 of this podcast because the point is such a pivotal part of your novel. I, of course, decided to make it the first thing I talked about on my podcast. Anyway, I will put the link to that episode in the show notes of this one. But for now, let's keep talking about the second beat of this novel. Okay, the fun thing about the point stated beat is that you will literally have a character state in their dialogue what the protagonist and the reader is supposed to walk away from your story understanding. They will literally say it. But here's the trick. You do it so subtly, so naturally, that neither the protagonist nor the reader realizes what you've done. It's like you're being a magician, slipping the idea into the narrative without drawing attention to it. Often, this line of dialogue is delivered by a secondary character, and the protagonist might brush it off or fail to grasp its real significance. For the reader, though, it does plant a seed, a breadcrumb to pick up on later as the story unfolds. For example, if your point was that racism flourishes when we dehumanize one another, then you might have a secondary character say something like, "People can't hate up close." At first, the protagonist might brush it off or think it's irrelevant to their struggles. But for the reader, it's the key to the whole story, and it will be firmly planted in their subconscious. For example, in the movie Up, when Carl meets 8-year-old Ellie, his future wife, she is hanging out a window screaming, "Adventurer is out there!" And throughout most of the movie, this moment serves to reinforce Carl's misbelief that adventure happens in faraway places. But by the end of the story, he realizes the deeper truth that Ellie learned long before he did. Adventure doesn't only happen in faraway places. The ordinary life that you live with the people you love is full of the best and most meaningful kinds of adventure. Meaning, adventure is really out there in your own ordinary life. The third beat is called the setup. The setup is a multi-scene beat, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It means that this is one big beat, but it has many scenes that make it up. And the setup is where you continue to lay the foundation for everything to come. You continue to introduce your protagonist's ordinary world, relationships, routines, and goals, giving the readers a sense of what's at stake when the status quo world inevitably becomes disrupted. This section is also where you begin to plan for the future of your novel. You can foreshadow conflicts, you can continue to hint at your protagonist's flaws and the problems in their life, and you can introduce subplots. It really just expands on the opening image and deepens our understanding of the protagonist's life. One of the biggest mistakes I see writers make at the beginning of their novel is that they do not develop their protagonist and their protagonist's world nearly enough. They think that if they move straight into the catalyst and skip all the beginning setup, they're less likely to lose readers' attention. The truth is just the opposite. After all, the setup is that wonderful part of the novel where we start to get to know the protagonist. If the opening image is like the first date where you meet at a coffee shop just to make sure nobody gives anybody else the heebie-jeebies, then the setup is really the second date and the third date and the fourth date, where you start getting to know that special person and determining if you really like them enough to keep going. And if you skip the setup, or if you skimp on it, readers just won't invest in the novel, no matter how exciting the catalyst. For example, in the movie Up, we watch Carl and Ellie's life unfold through a heartfelt montage. We see Ellie show Carl her adventure book and tell him that someday she's going to live in Paradise Falls. She even has a bunch of blank pages at the end of her book for all the adventures she'll have there, and she makes Carl promise that someday he'll take them both there in a blimp. But of course, Ellie and Carl grow up. They get married, they build a home. Life gets in the way of their dreams. They have to pay bills, make home repairs, and they even have heartbreak, including the loss of a child. They never make it to Paradise Falls. And Ellie's eventual death leaves Carl alone in a house filled with memories, clinging to the past. The emotional weight of this setup makes us deeply empathize with Carl, and it makes sure that we are ready to take his journey with him because we already care so much about him. The fourth beat in the Save the Cat framework is called the catalyst. Many writers also know this as the inciting incident. It is the first major push that changes everything for your protagonist. It's the moment when their status quo world is completely disrupted. Something unexpected happens to them, and it gets the story in motion. Think of it as the event that launches them out of their comfort zone, whether they're ready or not. It's that external push that forces your protagonist to respond, even if they're reluctant. The catalyst is often a problem, an opportunity, or a life-altering situation that creates the question, what will they do now? For example, from the movie Up, Carl's neighborhood has transformed into a bustling construction zone with towering cranes and noisy machinery surrounding his small, quaint house. Developers are eager to buy his property to make way for a massive urban development, but Carl stubbornly refuses to sell, clinging to the home that he and Ellie built together. Despite increasing pressure and frequent visits from the construction workers, Carl remains steadfast, seeing his house as the last tangible piece of his life with Ellie amidst the chaos of progress. But Carl's quiet life is shattered when a construction truck damages his and Ellie's beloved mailbox. In a fit of rage, Carl strikes the construction worker with his cane, leading to a court order to move to a retirement home. This moment serves as the catalyst for Carl's decision to take a drastic action and reclaim control over his life. The fifth beat in the Save the Cat framework is called the debate. As we know, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and that's what we see here in the debate. Something happened, the catalyst, and now your protagonist has to react to it. They have to have an internal debate. If the catalyst ended with us thinking, what will they do now? This is where the protagonist actually gets to debate that very question. What will they do now? So this beat explores the protagonist's hesitation and internal struggle. Should they accept the call to adventure or stay within the safety of the familiar? The debate is where the protagonist weighs their options, grapples with their fear, doubt, or even denial. It's the last moment of reflection before they figure out what they're going to do and take a plunge into the unknown, accepting the call to adventure and really diving into the story that the readers came to read. For example, from the movie Up, Carl sits in his empty house, flipping through Ellie's adventure book and reminiscing about their life together. He's torn between holding on to the past and taking a bold step forward. Okay, my friends, that's it for today. If you're interested in getting the workbook for this episode so you can use it to help you plot the first act of your novel, you'll find that link right in the show notes. If you're curious about private book coaching or group book coaching, please go ahead and sign up for a program clarity chat. You'll also find that link in the show notes. You'll also find links to Ask Me Anything Thursdays, where you can ask me your burning writing question. And you can find a link to get a snap critique of the first scene, 5 pages or fewer, of your novel. So whatever you're interested in, I bet you can find it in the show notes. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, the world needs your stories right now, so don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself. Talk soon.